Hey y'all, so this video is to address the ongoing protests that are happening in Ciudad de Mexico, but what I assume can continue to happen all throughout Mexico as people are protesting the gentrification, the colonization of Americans moving over here, driving up the cost of rent, increasing the property taxes, and ultimately displacing people from their homes. So before I even get into all the things, let me first just start off by setting the tone. If you are a white person or a person who has engaged in gentrification, to the back. To the back of this conversation, because what I'm not going to do is go back and forth in my comment section with y'all. What I'm not going to do is sit here and hold space for people who have engaged in the same systems that have disenfranchised my people. So I want to be clear about that. And I am going to have a very layered and complex conversation, but I don't want for people who have not done the work to investigate your own history, who have not done the work to sit with and examine your relationship to land and your ancestors, to then try to get on this platform and consistently be in the comment sections and in the DMs of Black creators and Black women and other folks who have experienced oppression, brown folks, indigenous folks, as if you have done the work when you have not, right? So let's just start there, full stop, putting it out there. That's where we're starting today. So moving right along. When we talk about things like gentrification, when we talk about things like colonization, it is important for us to really define, like, where are we landing in this conversation? Like, are we on the same page? So the first thing I really want to do is like define what these things are, so then we can really have a conversation of how they're showing up. And I also want to name, like, why is this my business? So this is my business because, one, I have a coaching program that is supporting people with relocating out of the United States and preferably moving over to Mexico, because that has been my experience of getting over here. However, I am open to people moving to other countries and supporting them with that process. And I'm very transparent that I don't have the direct experience to be able to speak in detail about what that can look like for them. And so majority of the people that are in my coaching program are moving from the United States over to Mexico. And so this is why it's important to me. It's important to me also because I live in Mexico. I'm a resident of Mexico. I pay taxes here. You know, I own a car here. So I have been into the system of Mexico. I have family here. So all of that is really important when we start to have these conversations about relocation and migration, is really placing ourselves at, like, where are we at in these conversations and not remaining silent and complicit in the problems, but also really stating, you know, taking accountability and stating what are the problems. And if we are going to be moving somewhere, how do we do that in an ethical way that is honoring of people, culture, land, language, you know? So those are the conversations that we'll be having on this page in general, but also today in this video. So just to get into it, when we talk about, for example, colonization is a system in which a country, a business, in which groups of people come over to a place and try to enforce their policies, their culture, their language, their traditions, their way of knowing, their worldview onto a group of people. And often this is done through violence, and this is done through this group of people having more access to power, and so that they can basically disrupt the system and economy of the current country that they are trying to colonize. And so we've seen this happen really globally through imperialism. And this has occurred, you know, from my own experience. I can speak to, you know, my people, my ancestors, their experience of being colonized in Africa and then enslaved in the United States. And then how there's been multiple systems since then that have come about from that experience that have contributed to oppression of my people and my communities. So when we talk about things like gentrification, for example, that is when we have people, businesses, people who have more access to wealth and resources, who move into different neighborhoods, increase the property value, increase the rent, push people out of their homes. That is what we're talking about. Push people out of their businesses, because we have a system of capitalism that favors those who have more access to resources. And because of that, it is more common that, for example, if a government institution comes to your house and says, hey, we're planning to build a Starbucks on the corner. And oftentimes they don't tell you, right? It's real sneaky. It's real under the wraps how they do this. And so it's more like, hey, we're interested in your property, right? You haven't paid the taxes on this property because, let's say, 2 years, 3 years before they raised the property taxes, and you no longer can afford it with the access to resources that you have. And so we're interested in this property. You haven't paid the taxes on it, so we're going to pay you this amount to leave your home. That's the better option. The other option can be you're out of the home. Like, you haven't paid your taxes, we're kicking you out. You have 15, 30 days, even less for some people, to leave. And so that is typically how it's done. They remove people from their homes, they tear down the home, and then you see maybe a month or so later a Starbucks built in that place, or you see some other name brand business, or you see some rental property, Airbnb, an apartment, some type of representation of creating more income, particularly for those who hold that wealth. Where did the family go that was kicked out? Oftentimes, they're either pushed to more of the edges of where they live. So when I say that, they're pushed more to like the rural communities of where they live. And if they're not pushed there, then oftentimes they may be houseless and they don't have, access to recover if they don't have like a family or support system that they can fall back on. And do our government systems care about that? Absolutely not. Because this is what we see when we talk about things like housing crisis that are happening. There are many reasons why we have a housing crisis and a houselessness crisis, but this is a result of that. So, moving along, and then we have the term that a lot of people are seeing called gringo. So gringo, from my understanding and talking to a lot of local folks, talking to folks that have been here for a long time, is anybody from the United States that is moving over here to Mexico and oftentimes using US dollars as a form of currency. And when gringos come here, there is this enforcement of needing to use, for example, English, right? So they go to a market and it's like, oh, I don't understand Espanol. I need you to speak to me in English. Or, there's just so many ways in which it can be this enforcement of Americanized values in another country because of the discomfort that Americans often experience when it comes to having to learn something different other than what we're used to and accustomed to, right? So I really want to get into and unpack these terms. So we'll stop here now that we've kind of defined it. We'll stop here and get more into details about what this actually looks like, and then how we can be in a different relationship with these type of concepts. So, un momento, I'll be back. Okay, I'm back. So I want to, again, just be clear. The movements that are happening in Ciudad de Mexico, Mexico City, all throughout, these are movements of protection, of justice. I totally support them. As someone who is American, who moved over here to Mexico, again, some of the critiques are that a lot of people move here, they do not obtain their residency, they do not attain their citizenship, they do not pay taxes, yet they are able to buy properties over here in Mexico, drive up the cost on those properties by creating them as Airbnbs or rental properties, renting out to people who are also foreigners. And then as they rent out to foreigners, again, it really is a system of displacement because you have, for example, people who are used to in the US paying maybe $2,000 for rent, or higher, right? And then so that you come over here and you're able to pay a little bit less, but the local folks are not paying those prices. And so it does begin to impact them because then where are they living, right? When the houses that they lived in, the communities they lived in, the earth they were living on, it's no longer accessible. Where do they go? So, and then, it's not just about housing. Housing has been a bigger point in all of this, but it's also about job security. So I think about in my own household with my partner, a lot of jobs now will request, especially if you're in an area where we are, which is more like tourist centric, and people who are coming here, for example, from all over the world, but really like where we live at is super it's heavily English influenced. It's heavily Americanized. It's heavily westernized. Like, I can't even just put it in America. There's a lot of different people from all over different countries, but it's heavily westernized where we live. And so a lot of jobs, for example, if you need a job that offers you more access to economic privilege, you have to speak both English and Spanish, which is wild to me. Like, how are we in Mexico and we need to speak both English and Spanish to get better opportunities to jobs? That just does not make sense, right? However, that is like a part of how these systems work. And if you do not speak both English and Spanish, then you are getting lower income based jobs. When we talk about, like I was starting with, rent, most of the folks that I know here who are local may be paying, if I'm not mistaken, around 5,000 to 8,000 pesos in rent. Now, when we translate that over, I don't have my translating calculator up at this moment, but when we translate that over, that's around, depending on where, like the dollar, if we're talking dollar to peso, it's around maybe $300 and maybe to $500 a month, for rent. And oftentimes that's a lot for folks, because they're still having to put food on the table. They're still having to have other basic needs met. And so that can even be a lot. So you think about that in comparison to, as I started with, people who are coming over here who are used to dropping 3,000 USD in rent, like that is a very different, access to economic privilege that I think that we often miss when we come over here and just, I'm just here, living my life, doing my thing, but not like critically examining the systems. Now, I am clear that it's not always, for example, foreigners who are over here buying up the property and having these type of dynamics. I understand, like, in a more complex conversation, we can also name that there are people who have had access to privilege for a while, because I hear a lot here that classism is an issue. In fact, a lot of people will argue me down and say, we don't have racism here. We have more of a class issue, which, we can get into that at another time. However, because of the classism issues, you have a lot of people, for example, who love when, for example, the US dollar increases, because they know they have a lot of like foreign residents, and they know that they can charge whatever, however, for the Airbnb that they own. And these are local Mexicans as well, however, whatever. And, they can be living their life over here, right? Like, I know of a guy who is a Mexican resident. His mother bought the property, his Airbnb property, and he's been living here, and he charges $4,000 a month for that property for folks to live there. And so when we think about that, $4,000 USD a month, right? Living in Mexico, and it's full. So it's a very layered conversation, because it's not just like the impact of foreign tourism or folks moving here without having proper documentation, and like the way they engage with the system being in right relationship, but more so it's also about the ways in which capitalism is a global system, and it has spread, and it has also caused class inequity even here outside of the problems of like the foreign tourism, or outside of the problems of people moving here without obtaining like their visas or their residency and things like that. Now, I also will say, I'm not one to sit here on this video and go back and forth about judging people who don't have their residency or who don't have, their visa or whatever. I'm just stating, the commentary that has been shared, because I also know a lot of people who do move here, and that is their intention to obtain those things, but because of the country they were leaving, they don't have access to financial resources to start that process. So they're not over here, living a life of luxury. They're over here living basically like a lot of local folks are. However, they just have not had the resources at this point to like legitimize their process. So I also hold space for that as well, right? I do want to like be very clear. So something like a lot of my clients or people who are interested in working with me, we do have these conversations of like, this whole like gentrification conversation, right? And as a Black person, it is so important to like be able to like really break this down. So one of the things that I shared in my previous kind of video, like part one, we'll say, is that, the term gringo is really anybody moving from the United States. It don't matter if you Black, white, Asian, if you like, where there's this idea that when you come from America and you have this USD, you're making US dollars, that you are a gringo. So I'm aware of that, right? And I will say, after having conversations with people here, there has been some shifts in perspectives around that term, particularly for those of us who are of African descent or indigenous descent that are from the US, because there's this awareness of like, the struggles that you all are experiencing, we're all interconnected struggles. We're all in interconnected struggles, and that the gentrification that you're experiencing here is not new. It actually, began for a lot of us in the United States. And so when we talk about things, for example, of like me being Black American is not the same thing as being white American. Me being Black American is an identity that comes with a lot of pain, struggle, strife, and when we talk about things like gentrification, my community has been heavily impacted by that for generations. That has contributed to wealth inequity. It has contributed to, for example, the reason why the education system is disenfranchising communities of color, especially those of African American descent. It shows up in our access to job and employment opportunity. It shows up in access to fresh water and clean air and fresh foods, because all of those things are being dictated by our zip code, right? And so for those who might not have that awareness of how that works, is that even when we can go further back into American history, but I'll bring us right up to even to like structures of redlining, for example. So when we talk about redlining, we are referring to a system in which there were legally at the time, it was okay for a bank to discriminate on the type of loan that you got for your housing. So there was this intentional separation, especially during segregation, of like white folks getting loans to live in certain neighborhoods that were more like, we'll say, what am I saying? I'm losing my word because but they were living in neighborhoods known as suburban neighborhoods. There we go. And then Black folks were relegated to neighborhoods that were more urbanized. And in those urban neighborhoods, it also was a dictation of like what resources were put there. So it's interesting that if you go to a suburban neighborhood, you will see things like Kroger, you will see things like Publix and other grocery stores or fresh markets and things. But if you go to more urban neighborhoods, you see lots of access to like commercialized foods, fast foods that has pesticides and all other types of things in those neighborhoods. And that was intentional, right? Hold on real quick. I'm gonna pause here. All right, y'all. So I'm back. Maybe this is part 3, but just to say and summarize that, those of us who are from the U.S. of African descent, we can resonate and we can relate to the gentrification that we've experienced for generations that we're seeing here. Not that it's new, because it's been happening here too, but I'm really grateful that we're having this uprising, that we're having these protests in protection and defense of that continually happening here in Mexico. I am very, very happy for that. For me, my biggest kind of critique is just the reckoning and the delineation of like gringo white and gringo black. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I don't even, again, know how I feel about the gringo black, right? But that is something that I just want to be really mindful about when we talk about, again, how our struggles are interconnected in the experiences that we have. And I will name and say, obviously, if you're coming over here, no matter what your race is, and you have like this high access to wealth, and you're coming over here like buying up all these property for villas and displacing people, like, yeah, that's problematic. That's what we're talking about. Like, but overall, when we talk about like a group of people who know what's up, like that's what I'm talking about, is that Black folks know what's up, and so I don't personally like being lumped in with a bunch of white folks when my history has been, that my people are experiencing the same thing that is happening over here in Mexico, in the U.S., and it has been continual. And it's why, for example, a lot of us can't even live over in the U.S. anymore because of the impacts of gentrification. So I really want to really highlight that, right? And I want to talk a little bit, and I want to say too, like, I think the reason why the conversations are not about like, well, how is it different? Or like why we all get lumped in is because there is this like widespread conversation, obviously not among people who are, for example, Afro-Mexicano, obviously not amongst people who have experienced colorism, texturism, and featureism and know the impacts of that and racism and discrimination and prejudice here. But there is this widespread idea that racism is a thing of a past here and that there's not an issue of racism here, that there's classism. I've had, for example, when I talked about like one of my motivating reasons for moving here is to escape the oppression and racism of the United States. I had a Mexican woman tell me like, what is it? That's for real? Like, it's not that bad, is it? Like, that was so long ago. Like, what are you talking about? And it's like, girl, that is like today. Okay. Like, there is just this like intentional lack of awareness around the ways in which like global anti-blackness shows up and the experiences of Black folks, of folks who are darker complexion, like how that is different within these systems, because the systems are favored towards those who have more privilege, right? I mean, I've had doctors, I've asked them questions of like, so like, what are your perspectives around like race and culture? And they're like, what are you talking about? You know, like those conversations are almost seen as taboo. And it's intentional. Like, it's a byproduct of colonization. We just got to name it for what it is. Right. But ultimately what I really want to like conclude and say is that, you know, this is not an anti-migration conversation that we're having here in Mexico. Now, in the United States, that is a very anti-migration, anti-anything that's not white, with a lot of money. Okay. That's what the conversation is in Estados Unidos, in America, in the US, let me be clear. But when we talk about, for example, you know, what's happening here, it's not anti-migration, it's how are you coming over here and what is your posture when you get here? When I say posture, it's like, again, are you coming over here and displacing people? Are you coming over here and forcing that we must speak English? Are you coming over here and saying we can't do mariachi at the beach because it's offensive to you and we're loud? Are you coming over here telling me that we need to build a Walmart on the corner because that's what you're used to? Are you coming over here telling me, like, these are the conversations that are more so being had, you know? And so when we talk about that, it's like, how do we be in right relationship with the land, people, and culture? And for me, you know, one, being in relationship with the land looks like not continually contributing to ecocide. You know, it's not, for example, coming over here and like tearing down whole land masses and forests and jungles to build your retreat villa. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, for example, you know, you're not going to the stores that are like touristy popular, spending 3,000 pesos for a dress, but you're more so looking at like, where are the local folks at? Like, how do I go to the village and support people there? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's what that looks like. When we talk about supporting the culture, how are you learning the language? I had these neighbors that I used to live by, and they had been living here, I think, for 15 years. And they were like, how do you already speak Spanish so fluently? And it's like, because I got here and I learned it. Like, what? Like, for me, firstly, my household is a Spanish-speaking household. So here, outside of these like videos and stuff I have for like meetings, we do not speak English in my household. The second thing is that it was important for me to come here and learn. So like, I put all my free time went into that. All my time and even time that wasn't free, like it was navigating, you know, every single aspect of culture. I made myself uncomfortable because it was important for me to be able to learn the language and integrate into the culture. Not that the culture had to integrate into me and adapt to what I needed, you know. But a lot of people come here, they live here for 7, 15, 50 years and never learn a lick of Spanish, right? And so like, that's what we're talking about. You know, when we talk about like culture, like, you know, it's not coming over here and like feeling like people have to play your music, that people have to like erase like parts of themselves in order for them to get job opportunities, or in order for you to feel comfortable in their restaurants or comfortable in their stores. Like, that's what we're talking about. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, a part of human evolution and a part of us, you know, connecting and learning from one another is that we get to share aspects of ourselves in a beautiful way. And so like, even from the folks that I know, there are things that I share about my culture, being Black, you know, that people are like, wow, that's cool. Like, or, you know, there's some similarities here or there, you know? And so there are some pieces that, you know, do translate over well. There are some pieces that, you know, offer spaces for learning. And I think that's a lot different, you know, than enforcing the ways in which your livelihood and the way that you've learned to accommodate to this world. Like, that's a lot different than that. So the work that I do within my relocation program, it's not about just getting people to Mexico. Like, it's not just about that. When we're sitting in these sessions, it's also about understanding like these elements of the conversation of how do you come over here and you move here in right relationship. I'm telling people, like, I have a list of resources of local, of local supports, of local vendors. I can name the ways in which the Black community here where I live has gone into school systems and supported them and volunteered their time, to support the school, has raised money for local families to support with eating or clothes or whatever the case might be. We're not just here just to be here. We're here to make an impact, and so that's something that I can appreciate and that I pass along to my clients, is that energy and that heart of like, it's not just about being here, it's about being in reciprocity. And that's what's important. And so again, I felt that it's so important for me to come here and address this. Really not even from a space of addressing it more so, but from a space of like really sharing my posture and where I stand in the work that I do, in the ways that I embody my values, and the ways that I work with folks who seek to move here and also seek to move here in a way that's in reciprocity, in a way that's honoring of like what's already here, right? So yeah, if you're interested in learning more, I'm here. And of course, I'm definitely open, to respectful conversations and dialogues. And that's all that I have for now. So I will pause here, and I look forward to having more of these type of conversations as we just continue to expand and be in right relationship with one another and the earth. Thank y'all for listening. Peace.